Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of sources and extract the most important insights, giving you a shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today we're diving into the complex and, well, often contradictory world of V.D. Savarkar. He's a figure revered by some as this great nationalist hero, yet reviled by others as a really divisive ideologue. It's pretty rare to find someone who evokes such strong opposing reactions.
That's exactly right. And the source material we're looking at today really highlights this. It notes how both his detractors and his fervent supporters often view him quite narrowly, selectively even. You know, the colonial police feared him as a terrorist, but at the same time, he had this international admiration for his really strong anti-colonial views.
Right. So to understand how one person could inspire such different takes, our mission today is to unpack Janaki Bakhle's 2024 book, Savarkar and the Making of Hindutva. It's published by Princeton University Press. And this book, it meticulously analyzes his own writings, alongside these extensive British police surveillance files, which is quite a combination. So for you, the curious learner, this deep dive is about understanding not just who Savarkar was, but really how his ideas took shape and frankly, why they continue to resonate today. And just to be clear, we'll be impartially reporting on the content provided here. Our aim is to convey the ideas within the original source material, not to endorse any particular viewpoint. Okay, so we just mentioned those intense, almost contradictory reactions Savarkar sparks. To really get a grip on this, we probably need to go back to his early life, which sounds like it was pretty far removed from the image many have of the later ideologue. What shaped him then?
Well, yeah, what's fascinating and a key insight from the book is how deeply his revolutionary phase was actually shaped by global anti-colonial movements. It wasn't just an Indian thing. So when he arrived in London in 1906, his companions were described as this motley group of like-minded revolutionary Indian students. And they weren't just looking inwards. They openly idolized figures from other struggles. You know, Irish nationalists, Russian bomb makers, even Italian thinkers like Giuseppe Mazzini.
Mazzini, the unifier of Italy.
Exactly. And Savarkar wasn't just passively admiring him. Within 6 months, the book notes, he'd translated Mazzini's biography into Marathi. And by the end of that year, he founded the Free India Society, explicitly modeled after Mazzini's Young Italy. He also joined India House, which was a big hub for young Indian revolutionaries in London, set up by Shyamji Krishnavarma.
So he hit the ground running in London. And the British authorities, they noticed him pretty quickly then, even before his later ideological work.
Oh, absolutely, right from the start. His secret revolutionary society back in Nasik, the Mitra Mela, it quickly transformed into the Abhinav Bharat Society. And this wasn't subtle. It was explicitly modeled after Russian nihilists, aiming for India's speedy emancipation. They were actively trying to recruit people from railways, telegraphs, government departments, places they could get useful information. So yeah, the British authorities were onto him fast, labeled him an extremist, feared him as a terrorist.
Wow.
His early speeches were called rabid. He even got expelled from college for publicly burning foreign cloth during the Swadeshi protest, a big anti-colonial statement.
The source mentions something about an anti-Muslim tone, even back then, before his imprisonment.
Yes, and that's really noteworthy. Police reports from as early as 1906, so well before the Andamans, they already detected what they called an anti-Mohammedan note in his speeches. That's quite early.
And wasn't there also that controversial book he wrote about the 1857 rebellion?
Yes. The Indian War of Independence of 1857. He described the rebellion, interestingly, as a fresh start for a new nation. And crucially, he saw it as midwifed by patriotic Hindus and Muslims. Quite an inclusive vision for that time, actually.
But the British didn't see it that way.
Not at all. They were so alarmed by it, its potential to incite more rebellion, that they moved really fast to ban it, prescribe it, and stop it from spreading.
Okay, so this early, very radical anti-colonialism, it inevitably leads to his arrest. But that wasn't the end of his story, or his influence, was it? In fact, the source seems to highlight how his long imprisonment became this kind of pivotal crucible for a new and, well, potent ideology.
You're absolutely right. It wasn't an end, more like a transformation. His revolutionary activities did lead to his arrest in 1910. He was connected to the shooting of Sir William Curzon Wiley by his housemate, Madan Dhingra, and also accused of supplying pistols for assassinations back in India.
And there was that dramatic escape attempt, too.
Yes. His extradition from France, after that daring escape attempt in Marseille, it blew up into this whole international incident. Had to be decided by The Hague. Tells you how seriously the British took him. High-ranking officials like Lord Crewe considered him the most dangerous figure among the conspirators.
The most dangerous figure. And then he's sent to the cellular jail, the infamous Kalapanai. What was that like, according to the book? How did that experience shape him?
Right, June 1911, he's sent to the cellular jail in the Andaman Islands. Notorious place. He served his sentences under incredibly harsh conditions, hard labor, constant surveillance, and even locked away there, his influence was still feared. Publications demanding his release were banned, but here's the key insight, I think. Despite the brutality, he read a lot. Voraciously, it seems.
What kind of things?
A real mix. Western philosophers like Spencer and Mill, ideas about social evolution, state power, might have subtly shaped his thinking on national strength, but also literary giants, Shakespeare, Tolstoy. It was this diverse intellectual diet combined with the extreme isolation that really became the forge for his evolving ideas.
And this intellectual forging, this leads directly to his most famous work, right? Essentials of Hindutva.
Precisely. It was actually smuggled out of his later confinement in Ratnagiri, not the Andamans directly, but written during that period of restriction. He wrote it in English under the pseudonym Maratha, and when it was published in 1923, it was described as this passionately lyrical celebration of the Indian territorial nation. But as the book argues, it eventually became the de facto Bible of militant and exclusionary Hindu nationalism. It had a huge impact on modern Indian history, really crystallizing his deep suspicion of India's Muslim minority.
It's striking that this happens in the 1920s. Were there sort of global currents happening then that maybe mirrored this kind of thinking?
That's a really fascinating connection the book draws out. The 1920s globally saw this emergence of intense localisms. Scholars debate whether you call them fascist or semi-fascist, but there was definitely a shared mood, maybe. Think about youth movements like the Hitler Youth, the Italian Youth, Hungarian Youth, and then in India, the RSS Swayamsevaks, founded in 1925. The book suggests they all imagined a new man, young, militant, energetic, forward-looking, and the goal, to forge a non-cosmopolitan sense of identity and enact an identitarian and exclusionary politics. It puts Savarkar's ideas in a wider, if troubling, context.
Right. So, okay, he goes through this intense period of ideological development and confinement. He writes Hindutva. What happens when he's finally released? Does the rhetoric soften or does it harden?
Well, this brings up a really important point about the conditions of his release and how, yes, his views did seem to harden into what the book calls a deeply systemic anti-Muslim stance. He was released from Alipur jail in 1924, but under strict conditions, he had to promise to stay out of politics completely.
Did he stick to that?
Not really, according to the police files. Reports soon noted he was holding meetings, expressing views on things like hand spinning, which was a clear dig at Gandhi's Khadi movement, and nonviolent non-cooperation, satyagraha. This apparently led to a lot of colonial frustration, but interestingly, they didn't rearrest him.
And the book emphasizes this systemic anti-Muslim rhetoric, not just occasional outbursts. What does that distinction really mean for his ideology? How did it play out?
That's crucial, I think. It means it wasn't just reacting to events. The source argues it was fundamental, woven into his whole worldview, like his obsession with khilafat. That really defined the systemic approach. He kept focusing on it long after the actual movement faded.
Remind us quickly, the Khilafat movement was?
Right, 1920s.
Yeah.
Led by the Ali brothers, supported by Gandhi. It aimed to protect the spiritual authority of the Caliph of Islam as the Ottoman Empire was being carved up by the British. Savarkar, though, saw Khilafat as a profound menace. He used the word afat, meaning like disaster or calamity. He viewed Muslim internationalism as being in fundamental conflict with Indian nationalism.
Huh. But the book also mentions a kind of contradiction in how he talked about Muslims and Hindus.
Absolutely. It's quite striking. He'd constantly write that Muslims were cowards, which flew in the face of their historical reputation for bravery. But then in the same breath almost, he'd savagely criticize Hindu timidity and weakness, what the book calls a kind of national emasculation. And he would apparently cherry-pick gruesome events, often from outside his home region of Maharashtra, to scare his readers and hammer home this narrative of constant threat.
So using these issues to discredit Muslims, but also Gandhi.
Yes, definitely. In writings analyzing things like the Mappila Rebellion, or in tracts with titles like, "What even is this thing called Khilafat?" Quote, there's this clear urgency. He's trying to alert Hindus to perceived danger from Muslims. The book points out he sometimes depicted Muslim leaders making frankly absurd, fabricated claims like a Muslim having a right over a Hindu wife just by touching her. That's what the source details. His rhetorical strategy, it seems, often mixed actual facts, like riots, with this kind of fiction to build a larger historical argument. And his followers apparently copied this method. He also used the Khilafat issue specifically to push for programs of reconversion Shuddhi and Hindu political solidarity Sankirtan.
And targeting Gandhi directly.
Yes. He heavily criticized Gandhi for, in his view, not condemning Muslims in Kohat uncompromisingly after riots there. The implication was always that Gandhi was too soft on Muslim violence. He'd use these incredibly sensationalized stories about cannibalism, abduction of Hindu women, even when newspapers like the Times of India were reporting similar crimes by Hindus. But he used them to paint Muslims collectively as monsters, extending one person's horrific act to the entire community.
And then there was his play, Sangeet Utsav. That caused problems too.
It certainly did. Written in 1927, it was a historical play, but the authorities suspected it was causing serious ill feeling between Hindus and Muslims. He did eventually agree to withdraw it under government pressure, but police reports confirmed it had already circulated widely across Maharashtra, hundreds of copies sold. It just shows the reach his ideas had even then.
Okay, this might surprise some listeners, maybe, because Savarkar was also seen, by some at least, as a progressive voice on caste. How does that fit with these other, exclusionary views?
Yeah, that's one of the most complex and frankly fascinating aspects, how his anti-caste efforts often seem intertwined with his anti-Muslim agenda. It reveals this very nuanced, but the book argues, ultimately self-serving approach. So yes, Savarkar was admired by many as a rationalist, a progressive voice challenging the Orthodox Hindu community, the Sanatani. He definitely projected himself as a radical caste reformer. But the book makes it really clear. His writings on caste were also about Muslims. His core argument often was that caste discrimination was the major reason low-caste Hindus converted to Islam or Christianity. Therefore, caste barriers had to be eliminated to keep Hindu numbers high.
So the motivation wasn't purely social equality, it was demographic, political.
That's the argument presented, yes. It was often framed in terms of strengthening the Hindu community numerically and politically.
So how did he critique Hindu orthodoxy? What was his line of attack?
He could be quite scathing, actually. He often satirized what he saw as Hindu outdated thinking or closed-mindedness, particularly this idea of vidabha, the intense fear of ritual pollution or contamination, even from something like dried peas touched by a Muslim. He believed this kind of thinking shackled Hindu grandeur and made conversions easier for other faiths.
Did he challenge religious texts?
He did. He challenged the literal interpretation of ancient texts. He scoffed at people claiming modern inventions like railways were somehow described in the Vedas. He questioned the absolute authority of the Manusmriti, the ancient Hindu legal text, pointing out its internal contradictions to argue for things like intercaste marriage and widow remarriage.
And he tackled cow worship, too. That seems counterintuitive for a Hindu nationalist figure.
Right, but he did. He ridiculed extreme cow worship, arguing that focusing too much on cow protection actually led to the slaughter of the nation because it, strengthened beef-eating communities. He even wrote, quite bluntly, that using cow dung and urine in rituals or as medicine was dishonorable and insulting punishment, not some sacred practice. It's this weird mix of rationalism and political calculation.
And he was involved in the temple entry movement for Dalits. That was a huge deal back then.
Yes, very much so. He supported temple entry for Dalits, which was a major focus for social reformers at the time, including Gandhi and Ambedkar, of course. He was influential in building the Patitpavan temple in Ratnagiri in 1931. The name itself means purifying the impure or fallen. It was inaugurated by the Shankaracharya, a high religious authority, and was open to all castes.
But there was a catch, wasn't there, according to the book?
There's a nuance highlighted, yes. He often seemed to put the responsibility back on Dalits to overcome their own internal caste prejudices, which kind of implied an equivalence between Brahmin prejudice and Dalit prejudice that, given the power imbalance, wasn't really accurate. The book describes his poems written about Dalit temple entry, like one titled, "We Are All Hindu Brothers," as sounding rather patronizing.
Okay, what about his views on marriage? If he was arguing for intercaste mixing, did that extend further?
Not really, and this is key. He emphatically favored mixed marriages, the source says, but only between regions, not caste groups. A subtle but important distinction, perhaps aimed at national unity among Hindus from different areas.
Not between castes, then?
Not explicitly promoted in the same way, it seems. And crucially, he was deadly opposed, the book says, to the practice of marrying the European girls at this stage of our national life. And by extension, marrying any non-Hindus.
So the boundaries were very clear.
Extremely clear. The reform always seemed to serve his overarching vision of a unified, strong Hindu nation defined against others.
Okay, moving towards his legacy, his influence, especially on how history itself is presented and understood. That seems really profound. He wasn't just recounting the past, was he?
No, not at all. And this raises that critical question. How did he use history? And what kind of legacy was he trying to build? The book argues Savarkar believed the historian's job was not simply to narrate past events.
What was it then?
It was to rouse people to action, preferably violent action. He consciously, intentionally admixed the poetic, the historical, and the fictional to achieve this emotional and political effect.
How did that work in his writings?
Well, for instance, in Essentials of Hindutva, he deliberately used words starting with the re prefix, like reclaimed, revived, reborn. This was meant to suggest a continuous, cyclical Hindu history, always under threat, always needing a reaction to recover past glory.
Creating a sense of perpetual struggle.
Exactly. And in Hindu Petharashahi, another key work, he glorified the Maratha king Shivaji Maharaj. He presented history as this relentless Manichaean struggle, pure good versus pure evil, black and white. It was a battle for the deliverance of the Hindu people and the Hindu land from alien bondage, Mohammedan foes. It offered this really powerful, feel-good narrative for Hindus, a story of resistance and eventual triumph.
And later works continued this trend.
Yes. His 6 glorious epochs, written much later, presented a very defensive history. It directly argued against Gandhi's nonviolent non-cooperation. It even suggested that alliances with fascists, like the ones Subhas Chandra Bose pursued during World War II, were actually better, more pragmatic strategies for achieving national liberation.
Wow. Which brings us back to his fraught relationship with Gandhi. The book calls it a seesawing rivalry.
Yeah, that's the term used. A seesawing rivalry, where it felt like neither one able to ascend unless the other is descending, a constant tension. Now, importantly, Savarkar was legally exonerated of any implication in Gandhi's actual assassination.
Right.
But the book makes a critical argument that his constant stream of writing depicting Muslims as an existential threat, his calls for Hindus to regain masculinity through violent action. This rhetoric, it's presented as contributing to an environment, an ideological climate, where killing Gandhi seemed like a reasonable course of action to his assassin and like-minded individuals.
So not direct involvement, but contributing to the atmosphere.
That's the implication drawn from his writings and their potential impact, yes.
What about after India gained independence in 1947? What was Savarkar's position then?
Well, after Gandhi's assassination in 1948 and the investigation that followed, Savarkar found himself effectively back in house arrest and closely watched, this time by the new Indian state. This led to what the book describes as complete ostracization from the political mainstream for many years.
But he didn't just disappear from public memory.
Far from it. Despite that official sidelining, he remained and remains a major national and particularly regional icon in Maharashtra. He's genuinely deified by his followers there. His memorial in Mumbai, the Swatantriya Veer Savarkar Smarak, which opened in 1989, is seen as directly competing for prominence and recognition with Gandhi's memorial, Mani Bhavan. The book says it reproduces the old tensions.
And it feels like his ideas are still very much alive in contemporary politics.
They absolutely seem to be. The book explicitly suggests that certain current political actions, specifically the 2003 and then the more recent 2019 amendments to India's Citizenship Act, the CAA, and the push for a National Register of Citizens, the NRC, these echo ideas found in Savarkar's writings, particularly the way these policies tend to prioritize non-Muslim refugees for citizenship while creating mechanisms that could potentially render millions of Indian Muslims stateless. The book connects this directly back to Savarkar's exclusionary political vision.
So wrapping this up, we've covered a huge amount about V.D. Savarkar, from his early days as this revolutionary clearly influenced by global anti-colonial movements, to the forging of his Hindutva ideology in prison, his relentless systemic anti-Muslim arguments, that complex, sometimes contradictory stance on caste reform, and finally, this enduring, deeply contested legacy he has in Indian history and memory. He was undeniably a prolific writer, a controversial figure in social reform debates, and a really relentless ideologue whose vision of a Hindu nation continues, it seems, to shape public discourse today.
Indeed. And the source material really hammers home that Savarkar's multifaceted persona, all these different aspects we've touched on, it allows for very selective readings. One can easily focus on his wit or his arguments for certain reforms, maybe his erudition, while either overlooking or perhaps even actively embracing his intense anti-Muslim views.
Which leads to a final thought, really. Given what the source suggests that Savarkar's story allows for these selective interpretations, What does it mean for a society when the historical narrative of such a significant and divisive figure can be so easily fragmented, so easily reframed, depending on what a particular community or a political group wishes to remember, or maybe wishes to forget? It really makes you think about how we collectively process or maybe fail to process these really complex, challenging figures from our past. Something for you to mull over.